Your Excellencies, Secretaries of State and former Secretary of State, Senator and members of the House of Representatives, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and the Chairman of the United States Ronald Reagan Centennial Commission, the Honourable Frederick J. Ryan, Jr.
Thank you. Your Excellencies, Foreign Secretary Dr. Rice, Senator Blunt, and members of the U.S. Congress delegation, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I have the pleasure of welcoming you here tonight as we take part in the celebration of Ronald Reagan's 100th birthday, or as we described it earlier today, he would probably look at it as the 61st anniversary of his 39th birthday. We're delighted to see so many friends and associates of Ronald Reagan from both sides of the Atlantic here this evening. We have quite a program in store tonight as London celebrates Ronald Reagan Centennial. Earlier this year, the Centennial celebration began in cities and towns all across America, from tribute concerts to sporting events, conferences, academic conferences at top universities. Americans gathered to celebrate Ronald Reagan's birth, his life, and his enduring legacy that inspired freedom and changed the world. This past week, celebrations of the Reagan Centennial and the impact of his legacy have been taking place throughout Eastern Europe, and today, here in London. On Monday, in Krakow, Polish citizens and their religious and government leaders paid special tribute to a great president and a great pope. On Wednesday, in Budapest, in the heart of Freedom Square, Hungarians erected a statue of Ronald Reagan in recognition of his role as a freedom fighter. Then, on Friday in Prague, leaders from East and West gathered to reflect on Ronald Reagan's legacy of freedom and democracy and ways that it might address the challenges the world faces today. And now in London, in many ways, it's the culmination of events in recognition of President Reagan's centennial. Many of you were with us earlier today, where a spectacular statue of President Reagan was unveiled in Grosvenor Square in front of the United States Embassy. And now this very special gala dinner here in Guildhall. Of course, there are two very special people that we all wish could be here tonight. I do know they are both closely following the events and are here in spirit. Mrs. Reagan has prepared a message, and I'd like to share it with you. It reads, "Dear friends, the long-held admiration and special relationship that Ronnie and I have cherished for many years with Lady Thatcher and the United Kingdom lasts to this day. I am very pleased to know that there will be so many gathered in London to celebrate during the anniversary of Ronnie's 100th birthday. He felt a special bond with people who struggled to be free, and he was so very thankful that Great Britain shared our commitment to bringing down the Iron Curtain. I am so touched that there will be a statue of Ronnie in London to represent that special bond and to remind all who see it of the power of freedom. I wish I could be there to share in your wonderful celebration of freedom, but know that my thoughts, love, and gratitude are with you all on this very special night. Sincerely, Nancy Reagan." And as Mrs. Reagan herself has noted, no discussion of Ronald Reagan's accomplishments could possibly take place without reference to his political soulmate, his friend, and his partner in defense of freedom, Margaret Thatcher. And the very special relationship between Prime Minister Thatcher and President Reagan is embodied in the statue that was unveiled today. And I would say when you get a chance to visit the statue, if you look very closely, you will see a small inscription on the base that is personally signed by Lady Thatcher. And it reads, "Ronald Reagan won the Cold War without firing a shot." Who could have said it better? Well, now, to begin our program this evening, it's my pleasure to introduce a well-respected leader from the United States House of Representatives. Congressman Greg Walden is chairman of the House Republican Leadership and leader of the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology. He has been a member of the Congressional delegation that has participated in the ceremonies honoring the Reagan Centennial throughout Europe this week. Please join me in welcoming Congressman Greg Walden.
Fred, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Foreign Secretary Haig, Secretary of State for Defense Fox, Dr. Rice, former Prime Minister Major, distinguished guests. America and Great Britain have long shared a very special relationship, and we gather today to renew our common commitment to that bond of friendship and to the work that has been done by so many who have led before us in the cause of freedom. Now, let me be the first to admit that you probably don't celebrate the 4th of July quite like we do in America. Now, Ronald Reagan understood that, and so did Prime Minister Thatcher. In fact, President Reagan's first trip to British soil as President of the United States was at the invitation of Mrs. Thatcher to the diplomatic dinner at the British Embassy in Washington. Reagan recounted the event in his 1982 speech to the British Parliament. He said, and I quote, "Mrs. Thatcher said then that she hoped I was not distressed to find staring down at me from the grand staircase a portrait of His Royal Majesty King George III. She suggested it was best to let bygones be bygones, and in view of our two countries' remarkable friendship in succeeding years, she added that most Englishmen today would agree with Thomas Jefferson that a little rebellion now and then is a very good thing." Years later, when Prime Minister Tony Blair addressed a joint session of the United States Congress, he thanked then Senate Majority Leader Bill Frist for escorting him through the United States Capitol and for pointing out the scorched marks of where the British in 1814 burned the U.S. Capitol. Blair looked across the chamber of the House. He paused and he said he knew it had been nearly 200 years since that activity had occurred and that it was probably a little late, but sorry, which brought great laughter in the House. Indeed, it is best to let bygones be bygones. Throughout our shared history, American presidents and British prime ministers have played the leading roles on the stage of freedom. Roosevelt and Churchill, Reagan and Thatcher. They've had a God-given clarity of vision and a unique courage to speak the truth about good and evil. When others thought it was not prudent or politically popular to do so, they stood even stronger. They knew that right and wrong should never be subject to a popularity test. Our congressional delegation has gained an even deeper appreciation of the oppression and courage of the people of Europe in their fights for freedom. From Schindler's factory in Krakow, to the House of Terror in Budapest, to the streets of Prague, to the underground war rooms in this very city, we have witnessed where people were saved and where they were tortured. We have seen where Jews were rounded up and where Nazi and Soviet tanks mowed down innocent people on the street. And we have seen where men and women of courage seeking their freedom from oppression never, ever gave up hope. And we have come to better understand the words of our former colleague, Tom Lantos, a Hungarian Holocaust survivor whose work and memory were honored by the Hungarian government just last week. He often said, and I quote, "The veneer of civilization is paper thin. We are its guardians, and we can never rest." And he was right. To persevere in this great cause, our countries must govern from strength that comes also from a vibrant economy. It's not enough for our people to have freedom, but then lack economic security. Reagan and then Thatcher both knew and understood that. They transformed their governments and revitalized their economies. They believed that individual liberty and ingenuity would always win over government-managed economies of the communist countries. Ours would thrive, theirs could not survive. This is the echo we can hear reverberating off these great halls. In June of 1988, President Reagan came here following his Moscow summit with Gorbachev. He said to those assembled in this very hall, in a way, Marx was right when he said the political order would come into conflict with the economic order. Only he was wrong in predicting which part of the world this would occur in, for the crisis came not in the capitalist West, but in the communist East. That very evening, Mrs. Thatcher praised Reagan for his work, saying, "Your leadership has made America strong and confident again, and we in Britain should like to say thank you for being such a staunch and loyal ally to this country and to Europe." She continued, "I recall what Winston Churchill once wrote, where we are able to stand together and work together for righteous causes, we shall always be thankful and the world will always be free." Years after Reagan left office, author and former speechwriter Peggy Noonan wrote to her former boss and asked the president a series of questions, including what he thought his legacy would be. As for his legacy, Reagan wrote only this: "He tried to expand the frontiers of freedom in a world at peace with itself." As we celebrate Ronald Reagan Centennial Year, as we dedicate streets and statues as enduring reminders of his leadership and vision and determination, let us go forth in common cause with renewed vigor to keep the torch of freedom burning brightly for all to see. Let us celebrate together on this uniquely American day the unique and special relationship that our two countries share. Together, it is within our power, and indeed it is our responsibility, to never let the darkness of tyranny and oppression snuff out the light of freedom and liberty. God bless America and Great Britain, and may God bless Ronald Reagan.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, Ladies and gentlemen, please stand ready for the two loyal toasts proposed by the chairman.
The Queen. President of the United States.
Ladies and gentlemen, pray silence for the chairman.
Thank you. During his 2 terms in the White House, President Reagan appointed 2 highly distinguished ambassadors to the Court of St. James. With us tonight, representing the late John J. Lewis, the President's first ambassador to the UK, are Jeff and Elizabeth Lewis. Thank you for joining us. There you are. Yes, thank you. And also with us, representing Ambassador Charles Price, the President's second ambassador, are Charles and Drusiana Price. Now, for a pair of toasts and reflections on Ronald Reagan, we will hear from 2 men of high distinction, former U.S. Ambassador Robert Tuttle and British Secretary of State for Defense Liam Fox. Bob Tuttle serves as trustee of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation. He began his White House service in 1982 as assistant to the president, and in 2005, he was named ambassador to the Court of St. James, a post he held with, as a prominent British observer described, quiet elegance. Although quiet may not be the term most of us would associate with his 60 speaking trips within the UK, 200 media interviews, and Winfield House functions where he and his wife Maria Hummer hosted more than 25,000 guests during his tenure as ambassador. Please welcome Robert Tuttle.
Thank you, Fred. I won't be quiet, but I promise to be short. Maria and I are happy to be back at Guildhall. Our only regret, as Fred talked about earlier, is that Nancy Reagan is not here with us tonight. I spoke with her the day before we left for London, and she asked that she be remembered to all of you. And then she talked for just a minute about some of her memories, and of course she went back to that fabulous weekend she spent with the Queen. She and the President Reagan spent with the Queen at Windsor Castle. It was one of the great memories of her life. Speaking of the Queen, I think no one described our alliance better than she did, and I'd like to quote from that. "The Atlantic unites. Ours is a partnership that is to be reckoned with. That is the lesson of my lifetime." Now will you all please join me in a toast to the special relationship. To the special relationship. Cheers, 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 cheers. Here.
Thank you, Ambassador Tuttle. Dr. Liam Fox has long stood among Parliament's strongest champions of the British-American special relationship. Before the formation of the current government, he served as Shadow Secretary of Health, Conservative Party Chairman, Shadow Foreign Secretary, Shadow Defense Secretary. He's a man of broad domestic and international policy expertise, and what is more, a champion of free markets and a strong defense in the mold of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. Please welcome Defense Secretary Liam Fox.
Thank you. William Allen White, known as the Sage of Emporia, said that greatness, generally speaking, is an unusual quantity of a usual quality grafted upon a common man. Perhaps that's a description that Ronald Reagan would have recognized. A man who loved his country, who reveled in its values, rejoiced in its achievements, and passionately believed in the potential of its people. A man who believed that competition is the route to excellence, that the markets know better than governments, that we should cherish the saver, the self-made man, family, and community. He believed in equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome. He stood up for freedom against tyranny, whatever the cost. He was a man who saw fellow Americans not as a coalition of minorities, but a vast array of individual talent which, if liberated, could change the world. And they did. And he did. He stood by his friends and allies, courageous and loyal to the core. His strength and optimism brought light and hope to a dark and fearful world. The Cold War did not just end. The Cold War was won. It was won by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and those who dared to believe. I don't know tonight if he can hear us, but if he can, he will have that embarrassed look that only a genuinely humble man can possess. Please join me, ladies and gentlemen, in a toast to a great president, a giant of a man, an American treasure. We thank and we salute Ronald Reagan.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, we have a special presentation. I invite you all to watch the video screens.
It is easy to forget what the world was like in the spring of 1981.
In the decades before Ronald Reagan came to the Oval Office, the threat of nuclear war hung over the world like a shadow.
It was like having two Westerners standing in a saloon aiming their guns at each other's head permanently. There had to be a better way.
Yet even as the world's superpowers maintained this fragile balance, the economic disparity between them grew ever greater.
In the 1950s, Khrushchev predicted, "We will bury you." But in the West today, we see a free world that has achieved a level of prosperity and well-being unprecedented in all human history. In the communist world, we see failure, technological backwardness, declining standards of health.
So President Reagan provided support to the brave souls who were standing up against communist governments around the world. From Václav Havel, who guided the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, to the freedom fighters of Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, to Lech Walesa, who scaled the fence of Poland's Gdansk shipyard and organized the workers inside into the movement called Solidarity.
We must realize that no weapon in the arsenals of the world is so formidable as the will and moral courage of free men and women.
But unlike those who held the job before him, President Reagan believed Soviet communism was no longer something to simply be contained.
The West won't contain communism. It'll transcend communism.
And he was unafraid to speak his mind.
Communism is some bizarre chapter in human history whose last pages are even now being written.
Critics blasted him for what they saw as dangerously inflammatory rhetoric. Protesters massed by the hundreds of thousands. But President Reagan stood his ground, even calling the Soviet Union an evil empire.
The Soviet Union faces a choice. It must make fundamental changes, or it will become obsolete.
He knew strong words had to be matched with strong actions, so he reinvigorated the power and the pride of the U.S. military.
Since 1970, the Soviet Union has invested $300 billion more in its military forces than we have. To allow this imbalance to continue is a threat to our national security. I pledge to you that we will maintain the capacity to deter Soviet aggression at any level at which it might occur.
Yet even as he spoke his mind, he also reached out his hand.
I felt that if I could get in a room alone with the top Soviet leader, the two of us might be able to reduce the risk of nuclear war. If we were ever going to break down the barriers of mistrust that divided our countries, we had to begin by establishing a human, personal relationship.
And that moment, it etched in my memory. I remember that even at the steps of that house, something happened. The kind of handshake, the kind of openness.
It was almost immediate bonding. There was a warmth about him. There was a humor about him. You just liked him.
And a little later, at our next meeting, he said, "Mr. General Secretary, I suggest you call me Ron, and I will call you Michael."
I told him, we don't mistrust each other because we're armed this way. We're armed this way because we mistrust each other. And if you and I can eliminate the reasons for this mistrust, that other part, the arms, will take care of themselves.
Together, they issued a statement acknowledging that nuclear war could not be won and must never be fought. A year later, they met again. Across a small table in Reykjavik, Iceland, they negotiated to eliminate thousands of nuclear weapons.
Ronnie had called me and said, "Everything's going fine. I'll be home for dinner."
But at the last minute, Gorbachev made the entire deal contingent on Reagan giving up his dream of creating a space-based missile defense system to protect the U.S. and its allies.
Do you have an agreement, Mr. President?
President Reagan, who liked to say that if he could negotiate with Hollywood studio chiefs, he could negotiate with anyone, got up and ended the meeting.
I was watching on television when they came out of that little house and I saw Ronnie's face. I knew everything was not fine. They really went nose to nose. I think Gorbachev found out at that time that he couldn't push Ronnie, he couldn't bluff Ronnie.
With the Soviet economy growing ever weaker, Gorbachev soon returned to the bargaining table, and a historic agreement was struck.
This is the signing of the INF Treaty, the total elimination of a whole weapons system. They have never before agreed to destroy something they had already built. To the General Secretary, to Mrs. Gorbachev, to the relationship that I believe must continue.
6 months later, the president was greeted with cheers on the streets of Moscow.
It was a memorable trip, and this ancient city of pinnacles and spires seemed to come alive with optimism and hope. The era of nuclear arms reductions had finally begun. And for the first time, I thought we could actually look forward to a future not clouded by the threat of nuclear war.
Despite his success in eliminating thousands of nuclear missiles, Ronald Reagan knew that there was work yet to be done.
For too long, an ominous wall had been a sign of oppression and fear across a continent. Those people had to be set free, to travel where they wish, to live where they want to bathe in the light of freedom. And I brought that message straight to Berlin. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
And just 2 years later, the wall came tumbling down.
All of Eastern Europe, oppressed for decades, bubbled over with joy and optimism as they walked through freedom's door, away from the dark shadows of communism. The Iron Curtain came down for good. The Soviet Union was officially dismantled. My prayers for the end of the Cold War were answered.
There were many who helped steer the world from the shoals of nuclear danger to the shores of lasting peace. Gorbachev, whose policies of glasnost and perestroika opened the door. Pope John Paul II, who gave Polish solidarity his moral and public support. And Margaret Thatcher, whose opposition to communism was unflinching. Yet it was Thatcher herself who would say this: Ronald Reagan had a higher claim than any other leader to have won the Cold War for liberty, and he did it without a shot being fired.
Ronald Reagan ended the Cold War, the greatest diplomatic victory of the modern period.
We made a difference. It was a new beginning. We rebuilt our military strength and brought the world a little closer together in peace. But above all, we got America to stand tall again. And you know, I'd like to think that maybe that's the thing I'm proudest of. I've always believed when given the freedom to choose, people choose freedom.
"23 years ago, in this very room, President Reagan reported to the world on his recently completed summit in Moscow. With great optimism, he said, quote, "Quite possibly, we are beginning to take down barriers of the post-war era. Quite possibly, we are entering a new era in history. Today, the Cold War is over. Millions who were once enslaved are free, and we are living in that new era that Ronald Reagan envisioned." President Reagan would be the first to tell us that the transformation came not because of the work of a superpower, but because of the work of a super alliance. And at the heart of that alliance were the United States and the United Kingdom. To reflect on President Reagan and his legacy, it's my honor to introduce one of the formative figures of the post-Cold War world and a builder of great alliances in her own right. She's well known as a scholar, teacher, author, and practitioner of statecraft at the highest level. But becoming a leader in academia and a major player in international affairs were actually her backup goals in life. Her first choice was to star on as another kind of player on another kind of stage. Her dream was to become a concert pianist. In fact, in 2002, she demonstrated her considerable musical gifts when she performed with Yo-Yo Ma on a Washington concert stage. But thankfully, for the benefit of all of us, she kept her day job as Secretary of State. The loss to the world of music brought incalculable gains to America's foreign policy and the world's security. Please join me in welcoming America's 66th Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Fred, for that wonderful introduction. But I must start by telling you that although playing with Yo-Yo Ma was one of the great days of my life, I was not confused. I was not playing with Yo-Yo Ma because I was the world's greatest pianist. I was playing with Yo-Yo Ma because I was the National Security Advisor. I made a good decision to change my major. It's a delight to join you here tonight as we celebrate and commemorate the life and times of Ronald Reagan, the 40th President of the United States. Tonight, we have an opportunity to celebrate and commemorate his unshakable belief in freedom, in the values that we share. We have an opportunity to celebrate his toughness, his willingness, and his courage to put so much on the line to deliver on those values. And we have a chance to celebrate his partnership with the great Prime Minister of this country, Lady Margaret Thatcher. That partnership between two people, two leaders, of course reflected a deeper truth, and that is the partnership between two great nations, the United States of America and the United Kingdom. And so we celebrate that tonight as well. You know, from 1989 to 1991, I was the White House Soviet specialist at the end of the Cold War. And frankly, it doesn't get much better than that. I was fortunate enough to see the end of communism in Eastern Europe, the unification of Germany completely and totally on Western terms, and the beginnings of the peaceful collapse of the Soviet Union itself. Some days, as we went to work, it seemed that we were just on the right side of history, that events were unfolding at such a rapid speed and in such a one-way direction that it must have been somehow inevitable. But I had to always remind myself that there was a time, not too long before that, when it must have seemed impossible. In 1946, when the Italian communist won 48% of the vote and the French communist 46% of the vote. In 1947, when 2 million Europeans were still starving, necessitating the Marshall Plan. In 1948, when Czechoslovakia, the last free country of Eastern Europe, fell to a communist coup, the Berlin crisis threatened to split Germany forever. In 1949, when the Soviet Union exploded a nuclear weapon 5 years ahead of time, and the Chinese Communists won. And in 1950, the Korean War broke out. And of course, the troubles would continue. In 1968, the Brezhnev Doctrine would bring Soviet troops deep into the heart of Czechoslovakia. And in 1981, a coup d'etat by the Polish military would seem to end forever the hopes of a workers' movement called Solidarity to make Poland free. Yes, there were very, very dark times. And even in 1982 and 1983 and 1984, when one tough American president said, "We will deploy these missiles if the Soviet Union will not give up theirs," bringing millions of the people into the streets of Europe and Great Britain to protest him as someone who was bringing us closer to war. And so imagine that at the end of all of that, someone had said, here's what's going to happen. On November 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall is going to come down, and Germany's going to be unified. And oh, by the way, on December 25th, 1991, the hammer and sickle is going to come down from the Kremlin for the last time. Soviet Union, 75 years of communism, never mind. And in 2006, an American president is going to go to a NATO summit in Latvia. Who would have believed it? And so, we know what happens when people believe in their values and act on them. But it is all too easy to forget how hard it was to get here. I have students at Stanford who were not born when the Berlin Wall came down. Soon, all of this hard work will seem simply inevitable in retrospect. And so it is awfully important that from time to time we stop to commemorate and to celebrate the sacrifices of those who made those exceptional and extraordinary events possible. And so tonight we celebrate the fact that we all know that freedom is indeed universal and it is right. But we also know that when freedom is won, the hard work, in fact, has just begun. You see, freedom and democracy, words that we sometimes use interchangeably, are kin. One cannot be sustained without the other, but they're not exactly the same. Democracy is the challenge to build institutions that will ultimately safeguard our freedoms. The right to choose those who will govern you requires a reliable, understood, and accepted way to change power peacefully. It is true that the right to freedom from the arbitrary power of the state, to say what you think, to worship as you please, requires the rule of law. And democracy requires a lot of its citizens, because the practice of democracy is not just about the practice of rights. It is also about the taking on of responsibilities. Democracy requires that there is a wisdom to understand that it cannot be the tyranny of the majority that overturns and overrules the rights of minorities. Democracies understand and are wise to know that the strong cannot cast aside the weak, because a democracy is ultimately only as strong as its weakest link. And when the weak and strong work together to make certain that all are within the arms of a vibrant and functioning democracy, then democracy is really strong. And democracies, too, require citizens who will take on those responsibilities without a sense of entitlement or its twin brother aggrievement. Democracy is hard, it's complex, and it takes time. And at times, we, gathered here representing great and mature democracies, have stumbled. When the American founding fathers said, "we the people," they didn't mean me. My ancestors were 3/5 of a man in that first Constitution. And it was not until 1964 and 1965 that the great civil rights legislation finally made it possible for a little girl in segregated Birmingham, Alabama, to go to a restaurant with her parents, or a movie theater, or for her parents to be certain that they could vote without intimidation. And so, democracy is not an easy destination. It is a very tough journey. Nonetheless, we know that when the institutions of democracy are present, impatient patriots can appeal to them and use them to exercise their responsibilities and their rights. And so when Martin Luther King wanted to say to America, "You must change," he did not have to say, "America, you must be something else." He could say only, "America, you must be what you say you are." That is the power of democratic institutions. We are watching the unfolding in the Middle East and beyond of the desire and an insistence on freedom. We have to say to those who are seeking that freedom and insisting upon it, you will have to win it through sacrifice, but we will stand by you. And then we have to say to them, but after you have won your freedom, the hard work really begins. Liberty and freedom, to be secured, must exist within a web of rights and responsibilities. Only then can freedom and liberty endure. The responsibility of a citizen is to fight every day to make certain that liberty and freedom are enduring by their own efforts, day by day, hour by hour, brick by brick. We have, too, as we watch our values playing out across the world, a chance to reaffirm our own mature democracy's understanding of that principle of the rights and responsibilities of citizens. A woman named Lottie E. Sharpman had a phrase. She was one of the early participants in the League of Women Voters, a woman who died at 40, a woman who had been a refugee from Nazi Germany, and who believed, as she said, that democracy is not a spectator sport. That phrase was worn on a tie by Ronald Reagan quite often. And if you go out to the Hoover Institution where I live, you would have seen it on the tie of Milton Friedman, and you will still see it on the tie of my mentor and friend, George Shultz. Democracy is not a spectator sport. That is a message to us, and it is a message to those still seeking freedom. Ronald Reagan said here in Great Britain in his speech to the Parliament, "No, democracy is not a fragile flower. Still, it needs cultivating. If the rest of this century is to witness the gradual growth of freedom and democratic ideals, we must take actions to assist the campaign for democracy. Well, in fact, ladies and gentlemen, it's not at all gradual these days, the seeking of freedom and democracy. In fact, in our interconnected world, that desire for freedom is proceeding at a frantic pace, and sometimes with frightening ferocity. But I suspect that if Ronald Reagan were here with us tonight, he would say, "This is no time to lose your nerve. This is no time to doubt the abilities, the desires, and the ultimate success of those who simply want what you want." I suspect that Mrs. Thatcher might tell us not to go wobbly. Indeed, it is a time for faith in our values, because we have seen what can happen when men and women of conscience believe in those values, act on them, and make league with those who are seeking to exercise their rights and responsibilities. This is no time to lose our nerve. Freedom is on the march. Thank God for that. May God bless the United States of America. May God bless Great Britain. And may God bless the memory of Ronald Wilson Reagan. Thank you.
Dr. Rice, thank you for those wonderful remarks. Like President Reagan, William Hague is known as a gifted speaker. His first address that achieved national attention was delivered at the age of 16 at the Conservative Party Annual Congress. It was far from his last. At age 27, he was elected to Parliament. By 36, he was leader of his party in Parliament. And following the Conservative defeat in 2001, he took a vacation from leadership. Although it was hardly a vacation, he used it to write widely praised biographies of Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger and anti-slavery crusader William Wilberforce. In 2005, William Hague returned to leadership as Shadow Foreign Secretary. And today, as First Secretary of State, he shapes this great nation's global policies. Please welcome First Secretary William Hague.
Well, Mr. Chairman, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor to mark the centennial of President Reagan's birth in your company and in this fine setting, and in particular to do so in the company of Secretary Rice, and also in the company of my close colleague, the Defense Secretary Liam Fox, and our former Prime Minister, Sir John Major, both passionate advocates and firm practitioners of our alliance with the United States of America. And it reminds me of another very fine occasion recently, the recent wedding of the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, which gave me endless opportunities for teasing the ambassadors who came to the reception that I held for them afterwards. I was able to say to one of the Arab ambassadors, "Look, there are 1 million people heading for the palace and we're quite relaxed about it." and to the American and French ambassadors in particular, that never had a royal wedding been celebrated by so many ardent republics. And it was wonderful to see. And now you have your revenge upon us in inducing us to celebrate Independence Day here in the United Kingdom. So, congratulations on that. And of all the invitations I have received as Foreign Secretary, Nancy Reagan's letter asking me to speak here tonight is the one I have accepted with the greatest pleasure. It was here in this very hall in the summer of 1945 that General Eisenhower, as he then was presented with the sword of that man there, the Duke of Wellington, for his part in the liberation of Europe, the great triumph of Allied might and will. Praised for his prowess, Eisenhower said here, he said, "Had I possessed the military skill of Marlborough, the wisdom of Solomon, and the understanding of Lincoln, I still would have been helpless without the loyalty, vision, and generosity of thousands upon thousands of British and Americans." That is true for all of us holding office in Britain and America today. Our ties are so strong because they derive from the unbreakable friendship between our people. And now as then, we share in each other's sacrifices and take pride in each other's achievements. Secretary Rice has spoken powerfully of President Reagan and of democracy. His unflinching faith in democracy has been vindicated by the success of the democracies of Eastern Europe, many of whom are now our trusted allies in Europe and in NATO. His bold conviction that the Berlin Wall could and should come down, and that the Soviet Union would collapse under the weight of its own contradictions, was not only utterly borne out by events, but did much to help shape those events. His legacy in Eastern Europe stands as proof for the whole world that conflict, division, and fear can be overcome, that walls can be torn down, and the bitterest of enemies reconciled, and that where dictatorship reigned, democracy can not only take root but also flourish. Ronald Reagan did not pay lip service to these ideals. He believed them with his whole heart. His passionate conviction and force of character live on in his many timeless speeches, letters, and stories. I'm particularly fond of a story he used to tell when he was first running for president in 1968 about a candidate for a city council who was campaigning in a local park. He went up to the first voter he saw sitting on a bench who asked him what he would do if elected about a flock of geese that roamed the park. The candidate replied he would ensure they were preserved unharmed. "You've lost my vote," the man said. "I can't stand these geese and the mess and noise they make." The candidate moved on to another bench and was asked the same question. Determined not to make the same mistake, he replied, "I would get rid of these darned geese straight away." The voter was outraged. "You've lost my vote," he said. "These geese are a national treasure, and I come here especially every day to look at them." On he moved, and the very next voter he met asked him the inevitable question about the geese. This time he put his arm around the voter's shoulders and replied, "Brother, on the question of geese, I'm with you." Occasionally in my work, I have reason to recall another Reagan story, which is what he said when harried by his staff to get out on the campaign trail at some ungodly hour in the morning. "Governor," his chief of staff said to him, "you better get used to it. When you're president, that fellow from the National Security Council will be there to brief you at 7:30 every morning." And after a pause, Reagan said, "Well, he's going to have a hell of a long wait." But of all the speeches he gave, there are two in particular which stand out in my recollection. The first was his unforgettable response that I quoted earlier today to the Challenger space shuttle disaster, which I'm sure many of you will remember as I do. Faced with this national calamity, He did not seek to minimize what had happened or look for someone to blame. He spoke words of comfort to the school children of America, those most enthralled by the wonders of space and most vulnerable to the fear, doubt, and incomprehension caused by this loss. And he spoke to America's adversaries too. He said, "We don't hide our space program. We don't keep secrets and cover things up. We do it all up front and in public." He said that's the way freedom is, and we wouldn't change it for a minute. And with one speech, he turned America's pain into strength and tragedy into renewed hope for the future. The second Reagan speech that I believe will live on for generations were his words on the beaches of Normandy on the 40th anniversary of D-Day. His diary records that he fought back tears as he spoke. Among his listeners were some of the Rangers who had stormed the cliffs of France in the face of intense enemy fire, when the future of Britain and of Europe hung in the balance. The president said, "Behind me is a memorial that symbolizes the Ranger daggers that were thrust into the top of these cliffs. And before me are the men who put them there. These are the boys of Pointe du Hoc. These are the men who took the cliffs. These are the champions who helped free a continent. And these are the heroes who helped end a war." He conjured up the countless individual acts of heroism that contributed to victory and the astonishing courage each Ranger had summoned, with guns raining down destruction upon them, addressing those who'd survived and recalling those who'd perished beside them. He said, "You were young the day you took these cliffs. Some of you were hardly more than boys, with the deepest joys of life before you. Yet you risked everything. Why? Why did you do it? What impelled you," he said, "to put aside the instinct for self-preservation and risk your lives to take these cliffs? What inspired all the men of the armies that met here? We look at you and somehow," he said, "we know the answer. It was the deep knowledge, and pray God we have not lost it, that there is a profound moral difference between the use of force for liberation and the use of force for conquest." Today, with undiminished power, his words exhort us to strive always, to use our strength for noble purposes, to hope for a more peaceful world, and to be confident in the enduring power of our values. Just as we saw in Eastern Europe during Ronald Reagan's time, so we see now in the Arab world in our time that aspirations for dignity, human rights, and political and economic freedom are indeed universal and irrepressible. As Reagan said, "No arsenal or no weapon in the arsenals of the world is so formidable as the will and courage of free men and women." This should chill the spine of every authoritarian ruler as he goes to bed tonight. The obstacles to democracy are even greater in the Middle East and North Africa than they were in Eastern Europe. But that should not deter us or the people of the region. If greater freedom takes hold in the Middle East and North Africa, it will not only be to the immense benefit of the people of the Arab world, but it will reverberate in every corner of the world where human rights are still denied. That is why our government has called for this generation to offer a new hand of friendship to the peoples of the countries on the southern borders of Europe, just as Europe and NATO allies did in the East in the 1990s with such lasting success. We must give them painstaking support to build democratic institutions and offer the genuine prospect of closer association with our countries. But we must also remember that the staunch defense of human rights and democracy is needed not only in the Middle East, but in many other parts of the world where freedom has been in retreat in recent years. In Burma, still walled in by its own invisible Iron Curtain. In North Korea, where people endure some of the worst abuses of human rights anywhere in the world. In Belarus, Europe's last dictatorship, where the wave of change that surged across the continent after the collapse of the Berlin Wall came to a crashing halt, and whose people we must not forget. So in this year, of President Reagan's centenary, we must maintain the unwavering commitment to freedom that he showed, standing against oppression wherever it occurs. This is indeed a cause worthy of the special relationship between our countries. And as we look to the future, we should be fired by optimism as well as resolve. Today, Britain and America are the largest investors in each other's economies, each other's top partners in science, research, and higher education, and our companies provide employment for 1 million people in each other's countries, while millions of our families and our citizens live, love, work, and study on the other side of the Atlantic. As Foreign Secretary, I witness every day, sometimes every hour, that the special relationship is indispensable to the security of our countries. Our armed forces fight alongside each other. Our intelligence services work intimately together to tackle some of the greatest dangers we face. And above all, our shared values remain deeply entwined together. There is no doubt that the world is a much better place for this close and powerful connection. 30 years after Ronald Reagan forged such a great partnership with Margaret Thatcher, tonight we celebrate it. In the future, we will always remember it. Permanently, we will be inspired by it. And you can be sure that we in the British government will remain utterly committed to the depth, breadth, and strength of our alliance with the United States of America. Thank you very much indeed.
Pray silence for the chairman.
I'm wondering if they're available to come back to California with us. And you too, sir. Well, thank you. Thank you, Secretary Haig, for those wonderful remarks. And thank you to all of our superb speakers tonight. As we conclude the evening, I would like to thank all of you for joining us for the Ronald Reagan Centennial celebration here in London. There have been so many great reflections on Ronald Reagan and his impact on the world. And as you've seen, the purpose of the Reagan Centennial is not just to look back, but to look forward. As President Reagan always made clear, the work of the Reagan Foundation should not just be about the success of the past, but about the promise of the future. To see the contributions that this foundation makes towards a better future, I would like to extend an invitation to everyone here to come and to visit the Reagan Presidential Library in Los Angeles, California. It's high on a hilltop, views of the rugged western landscape that he loved and the Pacific Ocean. It's a place that Ronald Reagan dreamt would be an inspiration to young people from around the world, a place where they might learn from his leadership and share his vision, a timeless vision of hope, optimism, and his belief that our best days lie ahead of us. We hope to have the pleasure of welcoming you to the Reagan Presidential Library. Until then, thank you for joining us this evening, and good night.
Ladies and gentlemen, please stand for the departure of the top table and the United States Congressional Delegation as they depart through the door on my left.